It was October 14th, 1976, at the Civic Center in Providence, Rhode Island. The autumn air outside was crisp at 52 degrees, but inside the packed arena, the temperature had risen to a sweltering 87 degrees from the energy of 19,000 devoted fans. Elvis was midway through his electrifying performance of Hound Dog when commotion erupted near the front section that would test every principle he held dear about treating people with dignity and respect. What happened next would transform an ordinary concert into a defining moment that 19,000 people would carry in their hearts for the rest of their lives. The woman's name was Dorothy Mae Fitzgerald, though nobody in the arena knew it at the time. She was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher from a small town in Massachusetts called Millfield, where she had spent 47 years shaping young minds and instilling values of kindness and perseverance in generations of students. Dorothy had silver hair that she kept neatly pinned in a bun, wire-rimmed glasses that had been her companion for 30 years, and hands that showed the gentle wear of decades spent writing on blackboards and grading papers by lamplight. Dorothy had been an Elvis fan since 1956, when she first heard Heartbreak Hotel playing on the radio in her classroom during lunch break. At 33 years old then, she was considered an old maid by the standards of her conservative New England town, a woman who had chosen career over marriage and independence over societal expectations. But when Elvis's voice filled her empty classroom that day, something stirred in her heart that she had thought was permanently dormant. For 20 years, Dorothy had collected every Elvis record, attended every movie, and followed his career with the devotion usually reserved for family members. Her small apartment above the town's only bookstore was decorated with Elvis memorabilia, not the gaudy commercial kind sold at tourist shops, but carefully chosen pieces that reflected her genuine appreciation for his artistry. A framed photograph of Elvis from his army days sat on her piano. His gospel albums were stacked neatly beside her collection of classical music. She had even learned to play several of his songs on the old upright piano that had belonged to her mother. But Dorothy had never seen Elvis perform live. For 2 decades, she had made excuses. The tickets were too expensive on a teacher's salary, the venues were too far away, she was too old to be caught up in such foolishness. Her sister Margaret, who lived in Boston, had offered several times to take her to concerts, but Dorothy had always declined, feeling somehow that a woman of her age and position shouldn't be seen screaming over a rock and roll singer. Then in June of 1976, Dorothy was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. The surgery was successful, but the diagnosis had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. For the first time in her structured, carefully planned life, Dorothy was forced to confront her own mortality and to ask herself what she might regret not doing if her time was shorter than she'd planned. The answer came to her immediately. She regretted never seeing Elvis Presley perform live. So when her neighbor's grandson, Billy, a sweet 19-year-old who sometimes helped her with yard work, offered to drive her to Providence to see Elvis's concert, Dorothy surprised herself by saying yes. Billy had gotten the tickets through a friend who worked at the venue, not great seats, section 15, row M, but they were inside the building where Elvis would be performing, and that was all Dorothy cared about. The journey to Providence had been an adventure in itself. Dorothy, who rarely traveled beyond the borders of her small town, found herself nervous and excited as Billy navigated his old Volkswagen through the crowded streets leading to the Civic Center. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing her best navy blue dress, the one she reserved for church on Easter and Christmas, along with her pearl necklace, a gift from her students when she retired. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, you sure you're ready for this?" Billy had asked with a grin as they approached the venue. "Elvis concerts can get pretty crazy." Dorothy had adjusted her glasses and smoothed her dress. "Billy, dear, I've spent 47 years managing classrooms full of teenagers. I think I can handle one rock and roll concert." But nothing could have prepared Dorothy for the sheer energy and excitement of 19,000 Elvis fans in full celebration mode. The crowd was a mix of ages, from teenagers to grandparents, but Dorothy was clearly among the oldest attendees. She felt both out of place and exactly where she belonged as they found their seats and waited for the show to begin. When Elvis took the stage in his white jumpsuit, with intricate gold and blue beading that caught the stage lights like scattered stars, Dorothy felt tears spring to her eyes. After 20 years of loving his music from afar, she was finally seeing him in person, and he was even more charismatic and commanding than she had imagined. For the first hour, Dorothy sat politely in her seat, applauding at appropriate moments and singing along quietly to songs she knew by heart. Unlike the younger fans around her who were screaming and reaching toward the stage, Dorothy maintained the composed demeanor that had served her well as an educator. She was enjoying the concert immensely, but she was determined to maintain her dignity. That restraint lasted until Elvis began singing "Love Me Tender." The song had always held special meaning for Dorothy. It was the first Elvis song she had learned to play on piano, the one she hummed while grading papers in the evening, the one that had somehow become the soundtrack to her quiet, solitary life. When Elvis's voice filled the arena with those familiar, beloved lyrics, something inside Dorothy's carefully constructed composure cracked open. Before she realized what she was doing, Dorothy was on her feet, singing along with tears streaming down her face. The reserved school teacher who had spent her life maintaining proper boundaries was suddenly transformed into a woman experiencing pure, unfiltered joy. Billy watched in amazement as his elderly neighbor swayed to the music, her hands pressed to her heart, her face radiant with happiness. "Mrs. Fitzgerald," he whispered, "I've never seen you like this." But Dorothy was beyond hearing him. For the first time in her 73 years, she was allowing herself to feel something without analyzing it, without questioning whether it was appropriate or dignified. She was simply, completely happy. That's when the trouble started. A security guard, a young man in his 20s who took his job very seriously, noticed Dorothy's enthusiastic behavior and misinterpreted it entirely. He saw an elderly woman standing and moving around, apparently confused or disoriented, possibly suffering from some kind of medical episode that required intervention. The guard, whose name tag read Mike and who had been working concert security for only 3 months, approached Dorothy with the kind of authoritative manner that comes from limited experience and too much confidence. "Ma'am," he said, placing a firm hand on Dorothy's shoulder, "I'm going to need you to sit down. You're disturbing other patrons." Dorothy, startled by the sudden interruption to her moment of bliss, looked up at the young security guard with confusion. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "You need to sit down and stay seated," Mike repeated, his voice louder now to be heard over the music. "If you can't control yourself, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Billy immediately stood up. "Hey, she's not doing anything wrong, she's just enjoying the music." But Mike, perhaps feeling that his authority was being challenged, doubled down on his position. "Sir, please sit down. This lady is clearly having some kind of episode, and for everyone's safety, she needs to be removed from the premises." The confrontation was attracting attention from other concert-goers in the section. People were turning around to see what was happening, and the distraction was beginning to affect the enjoyment of those nearby. Dorothy, mortified by the attention and deeply embarrassed by the implication that she was behaving inappropriately, began gathering her purse and coat. "It's all right, Billy," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the music. "Perhaps I shouldn't have. Perhaps this was a mistake." But Billy wasn't having it. "No, Mrs. Fitzgerald. You have every right to be here. You're not bothering anyone." Mike, however, was determined to maintain control of the situation. He spoke into his radio, calling for backup. "I need assistance in Section 15. Elderly female, possible medical situation, refusing to cooperate." Within minutes, 2 additional security guards arrived, and the commotion in Section 15 became impossible to ignore. Other fans were now openly staring, some of them beginning to voice their displeasure at the way Dorothy was being treated. "Leave her alone!" shouted a woman from a few rows back. "She's just having fun!" But the security team, now 3 strong and committed to their initial assessment, began the process of escorting Dorothy from her seat. One guard took her by the arm, while another cleared a path toward the aisle. Dorothy, who had never been in trouble in her entire life, who had spent decades being respected as an educator and pillar of her community, was being treated like a disruptive drunk or a dangerous troublemaker. The humiliation was overwhelming, and she stopped resisting, allowing herself to be led toward the exit with tears of shame replacing her earlier tears of joy. That's when Elvis saw what was happening. Elvis had been in the middle of hound dog, working the crowd with his usual energy and charisma, when the commotion in section 15 caught his attention. At first, he couldn't make out exactly what was occurring, but he could see security guards moving through the audience and what appeared to be an elderly woman being escorted out of the venue. Elvis's relationship with his audiences had always been deeply personal. He prided himself on creating an environment where people felt safe to express their joy, where fans of all ages could come together to celebrate music and life. The sight of an elderly woman being removed from his concert went against everything he believed about what his performances should represent. Without finishing the song, Elvis signaled to his band to stop playing. The sudden silence in the arena was jarring, and all 19,000 people immediately focused their attention on the stage, wondering what had happened. Hold on, Elvis said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. There seems to be some kind of problem down there in section 15. What's going on? The security guards, realizing that Elvis himself was now watching their actions, froze in the aisle, with Dorothy still in their grasp. The entire arena fell silent, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would unfold. Elvis shielded his eyes with his hand and peered into the audience. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice gentle but clear, "are you all right?" Dorothy, mortified beyond words, could barely speak, but somehow, summoning the voice that had commanded respect in countless classrooms, she managed to respond. "I'm fine, Mr. Presley," she called back, her voice shaky but audible. "I was just enjoying your music. Perhaps too much for a woman my age." The arena remained silent, but you could feel the collective intake of breath as 19,000 people waited for Elvis's response. Elvis was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with warmth and authority. "Ma'am, how old are you?" 73, Dorothy replied. 73 years old, Elvis repeated, letting the number sink in with the audience. "And this is your first Elvis concert?" "Yes, sir. I've been listening to your music for 20 years, but this is my first time seeing you perform." Elvis nodded slowly, and when he spoke next, his words would be remembered by everyone in that arena for the rest of their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made 19,000 people hang on every word, "I want everyone in this building to understand something. Music is for everyone. Joy is for everyone. And if a 73-year-old schoolteacher wants to stand up and dance to my music after 20 years of waiting to see me perform, then by God she's going to dance." The crowd erupted in applause, but Elvis held up his hand for silence. "Now, I want those security guards to escort that lady back to her seat immediately, and I want them to apologize for embarrassing her." His voice carried the unmistakable tone of a man who expected to be obeyed. "And furthermore, I want everyone in this arena to understand that we're here to celebrate music and life, and anyone who wants to express their joy is welcome to do so." The security guards, faced with 19,000 people, and Elvis Presley himself disagreeing with their actions, had no choice but to comply. They gently escorted Dorothy back to her seat, with the lead guard offering a quiet apology as they walked. But Elvis wasn't finished. "Ma'am," he called out as Dorothy settled back into her seat. "What's your name?" "Dorothy Fitzgerald," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Miss Dorothy Fitzgerald," Elvis said with a smile in his voice. "This next song is for you, and I want you to dance if you feel like it, sing if you want to, and enjoy every minute of it." What happened next was pure magic. Elvis began singing "Love Me Tender" again, but this time it was different. This time, it was a personal serenade to a 73-year-old schoolteacher who had waited 20 years to see her hero perform. Dorothy stood up and swayed to the music, tears of joy once again replacing her tears of humiliation. But something beautiful happened throughout the arena. Other audience members began standing too, not just the young fans, but older adults who perhaps had been sitting politely, feeling too mature to express their excitement openly. Within minutes, the entire arena was on its feet, swaying together to Elvis's gentle ballad, young and old, united in the understanding that music transcends age, that joy has no expiration date, and that everyone deserves to express their happiness without judgment. When the song ended, Elvis addressed the crowd one more time. "You know, folks, Dorothy here reminded me of something important tonight. She reminded me that music isn't just for young people. It's not just for any one group of people. Music is the universal language that connects us all, regardless of our age or background." He paused, looking directly towards section 15. "Dorothy, thank you for waiting 20 years to see me perform. Thank you for showing us all what pure joy looks like. And thank you for reminding us that it's never too late to dance." The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever heard at an Elvis concert. It wasn't the screaming hysteria usually associated with his performances, but something deeper, a recognition of human dignity, of the power of standing up for what's right, and of the beauty that comes when people of all ages come together to celebrate life. Elvis finished the concert with renewed energy, dedicating several more songs to all the Dorothy Fitzgeralds out there who never let age stop them from living life to the fullest. The atmosphere in the arena had been transformed from a typical rock concert into something that felt more like a community celebration. After the show, Elvis asked his security chief to find Dorothy and bring her backstage. When she arrived, still somewhat overwhelmed by the evening's events, Elvis greeted her with the kind of genuine warmth that had made him beloved by millions. "Dorothy," he said, "I want to apologize for what happened tonight. That should never have occurred." Dorothy, ever the gracious teacher, smiled and shook her head. "Mr. Presley, you turned what could have been the most embarrassing moment of my life into the most wonderful. I can't thank you enough." Elvis spent 20 minutes talking with Dorothy about her career as a teacher, her love of music, and her recent health scare. When she mentioned that she had learned to play several of his songs on piano, his face lit up with genuine interest. "You know what, Dorothy?" he said. "I want you to have this." He removed one of the silk scarves he'd been wearing during the performance and placed it gently around her shoulders. "Every time you play one of my songs on your piano, I want you to remember that you have every right to enjoy music at any age." Dorothy treasured that scarf for the rest of her life. She lived for 7 more years after that concert, cancer-free, and with a renewed appreciation for the importance of embracing joy whenever and wherever it presents itself. She often told the story of that night to her former students, friends, and anyone who would listen, using it as an example of how one person's kindness can transform an entire situation. Billy, who had witnessed the entire evening, later said that seeing Elvis stand up for his elderly neighbor taught him more about character and leadership than anything he'd learned in school. He went on to become a teacher himself, inspired by both Dorothy's dedication to education and Elvis's demonstration of using influence to protect those who needed it. The concert became legendary among Elvis fans, known as the Dorothy Concert, or the night Elvis stopped the show for a teacher. Bootleg recordings of that evening are treasured not just for the music, but for the captured moment when 19,000 people learned that true star power comes not from commanding others, but from lifting them up. Years later, musicians and performers would reference that night as an example of how to handle difficult situations with grace and dignity. Elvis's decision to stop his performance, challenge security, and defend an elderly fan became a template for how artists should treat their audiences, not as consumers to be controlled, but as human beings deserving of respect and dignity. But perhaps the most important legacy of that October night in Providence was the reminder it gave to everyone present that age is just a number, that joy has no expiration date, and that we all deserve to dance to the music that moves our souls, regardless of what others might think. Dorothy Fitzgerald passed away peacefully in 1983, and at her funeral her family played "Love Me Tender" as mourners filed past her casket. Many of those present remembered the story she had told so often about the night Elvis Presley stood up for her right to enjoy music at 73 years old. The silk scarf Elvis gave her was buried with her, along with a note she had written shortly before her death. "Thank you, Elvis, for reminding me that it's never too late to dance. Thank you for showing 19,000 people that kindness matters more than rules. And thank you for proving that the greatest performers are those who use their platform to lift others up." That night in Providence proved that sometimes the most important moments in entertainment history happen not because of what's planned, but because of how we respond to the unexpected. It showed that true greatness lies not in following protocol, but in following our hearts and standing up for what's right, even when it means stopping the show.